December 11th, 1941. Adolf Hitler strode to the podium of the Reichstag in Berlin's Kroll Opera House, his voice rising with theatrical fury as he declared war on the United States of America. For 90 minutes he spoke, recounting every perceived American slight, every insult, every act of what he called provocation. He mocked President Roosevelt as a warmonger controlled by Jewish interests. He dismissed American military power as negligible. He declared that Germany and its Axis partners would crush this mongrel nation of immigrants and racial inferiors. The deputies applauded. The cameras rolled. Hitler's confidence was absolute. He had no idea what he had just done. The Führer's understanding of America had always been filtered through the lens of his racial ideology. He saw a nation weakened by democracy, corrupted by Jewish influence, diluted by what he considered inferior races. In his mind, this made America fundamentally incapable of military greatness. He had said as much countless times in private conversations, dismissing American society as decadent, its people as soft, its mixed population as a fatal weakness rather than a strength. This wasn't mere propaganda for public consumption. Hitler genuinely believed it. His knowledge of America came largely from superficial observations and racist assumptions. He knew about American industrial capacity in abstract terms, had heard about Henry Ford's assembly lines, understood that America produced automobiles in staggering numbers. But he interpreted this through his ideological framework. Mass production of consumer goods didn't translate to military might in his mind. Making cars for housewives wasn't the same as forging an army. And besides, America was far away, protected by two oceans, historically isolationist. Even if they wanted to fight, how would they project power across the Atlantic? Hitler had spent 2 years watching Britain struggle to defend its own island. The idea that America could somehow build, transport, and sustain a military force capable of invading continental Europe seemed absurd. When news of Pearl Harbor reached him on December 7, 1941, Hitler was at the Wolfschanze, his headquarters in East Prussia. According to those present, he was initially surprised, then quickly pleased. Japan had struck first, which technically meant Germany wasn't obligated to join the war under the Tripartite Pact. But Hitler saw opportunity. He had been seeking a pretext to begin unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping, which had been supplying Britain for over a year. Now he had it. 4 days later, he made it official. In that Reichstag speech, Hitler's contempt for America was palpable. He portrayed Roosevelt as a failed politician who had destroyed the American economy through misguided New Deal policies, who now sought war to distract from domestic failures. He mocked American military readiness, pointing out that just 2 years earlier, the United States Army had ranked 18th in the world by size, smaller than Portugal's, barely larger than Romania's. He noted that American forces had no combat experience, no tested doctrine, no battle-hardened commanders. These facts were true, but they wouldn't remain true for long. The first hints that something was wrong came in early 1942, filtered through intelligence reports that Hitler initially dismissed. German naval intelligence reported that American shipyards were launching merchant vessels at unprecedented rates. The Americans had developed something called Liberty ships, cargo vessels built from prefabricated sections, assembled with welding instead of rivets. The reports claimed these ships were being completed in weeks rather than months. Hitler didn't believe it. The figures had to be exaggerated. Perhaps American propaganda meant to boost morale or intimidate the Axis. Even if partially true, it didn't matter. His U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won. But then came the aircraft production numbers. In May of 1942, German intelligence provided estimates of American aircraft production. The numbers seemed impossible. The Americans claimed they would produce 60,000 aircraft that year. 60,000. Germany, With its entire economy mobilized for war, with years of preparation and expansion, was producing perhaps 15,000 aircraft annually. Hitler's reaction, recorded by several witnesses, was dismissive. He called the numbers Jewish fantasy, propaganda meant to demoralize the German people. Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments, tried to explain that American automotive factories were being converted to aircraft production, that the same assembly line techniques used for automobiles could be applied to bombers and fighters. Hitler waved this away. Making cars and making warplanes were entirely different endeavors. The precision required, the complexity, the need for skilled labor, these things couldn't be mass-produced like consumer goods. He was wrong. By late 1942, the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. American forces had landed in North Africa in Operation Torch, and while their initial performance was unimpressive, their equipment was worryingly abundant. German commanders reported that American units seemed to have unlimited supplies, that they expended ammunition freely, that destroyed vehicles were quickly replaced. This wasn't how armies typically operated. Even the Wehrmacht, efficient as it was, had to husband resources carefully. The Americans fought like they had infinite reserves, because they did. The intelligence reports kept coming, and the numbers kept climbing. American tank production for 1942, 25,000 vehicles. German production, 9,000. American truck production, 500,000. German production, 70,000. The disparity wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming. Hitler's response was to question the intelligence. Surely these figures were inflated. Surely American production quality was poor, their tanks inferior, their trucks unreliable. He pointed to early encounters where American M3 Lee tanks had been knocked out by German panzers. He noted that American troops in Tunisia had been badly mauled in their first major engagement at Kasserine Pass. But his generals were starting to worry. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, after fighting American forces in North Africa, wrote in his diary about the sheer material abundance the Americans possessed. He described watching American artillery bombardments that expended more shells in a single barrage than German forces might have for an entire offensive. He noted that American units, when pushed back, simply reformed with fresh equipment and tried again. There was no war of attrition with such an enemy. They could afford to lose. Germany couldn't. The turning point in Hitler's understanding came in 1943, though he would never fully admit how completely he had miscalculated. Albert Speer later recounted a meeting where he presented Hitler with updated intelligence on American production capacity. The numbers for 1943 were even more staggering than the year before. American aircraft production, 85,000 planes. Tank production, 29,000. The Americans were now outproducing all Axis powers, combined in virtually every category of military equipment. Speer watched Hitler's face as he processed the figures. There was a long silence. Then Hitler said something that Speer remembered clearly. The Americans can produce as many tanks as they want, but can they produce the men to crew them? It was a telling response. Hitler wasn't denying the production figures anymore. He couldn't, but he was grasping for some way to maintain his belief that America couldn't truly threaten the Reich. Perhaps they could build the machines, but they lacked the martial spirit, the discipline, the willingness to sacrifice that war demanded. This too would prove wrong. By mid-1943, American forces were landing in Sicily. The industrial capacity was now translating into deployed military power, and the scale was becoming clear. The United States had expanded its military from 174,000 active duty personnel in 1939 to over 9 million by 1943. They had gone from having virtually no modern armored divisions to fielding 16 of them. Their air forces were growing exponentially, with new groups forming faster than German intelligence could track them. And they were doing this while simultaneously fighting Japan across the Pacific. Hitler's public statements began to shift. He stopped mocking American military capability quite so openly. In speeches, he started referring to America's material superiority while insisting that German fighting spirit would overcome mere numbers. It was a significant change in rhetoric. He was acknowledging, however grudgingly, that America's industrial might was real. But in private, the realization went deeper. Goebbels recorded in his diary a conversation with Hitler in May of 1943. Hitler had been reviewing reports from the Battle of the Atlantic. Despite deploying more U-boats than ever before, German submarines were now losing the tonnage war. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than they could be sunk. In April alone, American and British shipyards had launched 140 ships totaling over 800,000 tons. The U-boats had sunk 39 ships. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Hitler, according to Goebbels, was uncharacteristically quiet after reviewing these figures. Then he said something remarkable. "We have underestimated the Americans." It was as close as Hitler would ever come to admitting the fundamental miscalculation that declaring war on America represented. The evidence kept mounting. In November of 1943, American bombers began appearing over Germany in formations that seemed to darken the sky. The 8th Air Force was launching raids with 300, 400, sometimes 500 heavy bombers at a time. Each B-17 flying fortress represented tens of thousands of man-hours of production, sophisticated manufacturing, trained crews. The Americans were throwing them into battle in numbers that suggested they viewed them as expendable. Because to American industry, they were. When a B-17 was shot down, another rolled off a production line to replace it. When crew members were lost, the vast American training program produced replacements. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war of attrition it couldn't win. Every German fighter pilot killed was irreplaceable. Every American pilot killed was tragic, but strategically manageable. Hitler's strategic decisions in 1944 reflected his growing, if incomplete, understanding of what American industrial might meant. He became obsessed with wonder weapons, with V-2 rockets and jet fighters, with technologies that might offset American numerical superiority. He poured resources into these programs with increasing desperation. The logic was clear. If Germany couldn't match American production, it needed technological breakthroughs that would make production numbers irrelevant. One jet fighter might be worth 10 conventional aircraft. One V-2 rocket might terrorize London into surrender where conventional bombing had failed. It didn't work. By the time the Allies landed at Normandy in June of 1944, the scale of American military power was undeniable even to Hitler. The invasion fleet included over 5,000 ships. The air support involved over 11,000 aircraft. The logistics were staggering. Millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all transported across the Atlantic and staged in Britain. And this was just one theater. The Americans were simultaneously conducting massive operations in the Pacific, island hopping toward Japan with fleets and air forces that dwarfed what they had deployed in Europe. Speer later wrote about Hitler's reaction to reports from Normandy. The Führer had expected the Atlantic Wall to hold, had believed that the Allies couldn't sustain a major invasion across the English Channel. When the beachhead held and then expanded, when American forces began breaking out into France, Hitler's response was to blame his generals, to claim betrayal, to insist that if his orders had been followed, the invasion would have been thrown back into the sea. But in quieter moments, Speer observed something else. A kind of stunned realization that Germany was fighting an enemy that couldn't be exhausted, couldn't be bled dry, couldn't be defeated through attrition. The American system was too vast, too productive, too resilient. One particular moment crystallized this for Hitler. In August of 1944, intelligence reported that American factories had produced over 96,000 aircraft in the past 12 months. In the same period, Germany had produced just under 40,000. The Americans were outproducing Germany by more than 2 to 1 in the air, while also outproducing them in tanks, trucks, ships, artillery, and virtually every other category of military equipment. And American production was still accelerating. Hitler's response, according to multiple witnesses, was to question how this was possible. Germany had mobilized its entire economy. Women were working in factories. Slave labor from conquered territories supplemented the workforce. Every resource was directed toward war production. How could the Americans, fighting on 2 fronts, separated from both wars by oceans, possibly outproduce the Reich? The answer was simple but devastating. America's industrial base was larger, more advanced, more efficient, and completely untouched by war. German factories operated under the constant threat of Allied bombing. American factories ran 3 shifts a day in perfect safety, thousands of miles from any enemy. German industry struggled with resource shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and damaged infrastructure. American industry had abundant resources, intact railways, and the Mississippi River system for internal transportation. But there was something deeper, something Hitler's ideology prevented him from fully understanding. The American system, for all its flaws, had mobilized voluntarily. Workers weren't slaves or coerced laborers. They were citizens who believed in the cause, who worked overtime willingly, who competed to exceed production quotas. The same democracy Hitler had mocked as weakness had proven remarkably effective at organizing and motivating industrial production. By late 1944, Hitler rarely spoke about America in his military conferences. When he did, it was usually to complain about American material superiority while insisting that German soldiers were individually superior, that 1 German was worth 5 Americans, that fighting spirit would ultimately prevail. But the mathematics of industrial warfare don't care about fighting spirit. The final phase of Hitler's realization came in early 1945 as American armies crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany itself. The soldiers who entered German territory weren't the soft, racially inferior weaklings Hitler had imagined. They were well-fed, well-equipped, confident troops backed by overwhelming firepower and logistical support. German commanders reported something that must have been particularly galling to Hitler. American units fought cautiously, using their material superiority to minimize casualties. They would call in massive artillery bombardments rather than risk infantry assaults. They would wait for air support rather than attack immediately. They fought like they valued their soldiers' lives, like they had the luxury of patience. Because they did. Speer recounted one of his last conversations with Hitler in April of 1945. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east and American forces approached from the west. Hitler was reviewing reports of American forces crossing the Elbe River. The Americans had bridged the river in a matter of hours, using prefabricated equipment, had established supply lines with remarkable efficiency, had pushed forward with what seemed like unlimited fuel and ammunition. Hitler said, almost to himself, "They have made war into an industrial process." It was perhaps the most insightful comment he ever made about America. The United States had indeed industrialized warfare to an unprecedented degree. They had applied assembly line thinking not just to manufacturing weapons, but to the entire war effort. Training was standardized, logistics was systematized, even tactics were refined through analysis and continuous improvement, like a factory optimizing production. This was America's true strength, and it was something Hitler's ideology had prevented him from recognizing until far too late. He had believed that war was about will, about racial superiority, about the martial spirit of a people. He had thought that Germany's supposed racial advantages and military tradition would overcome mere material factors. But modern war wasn't about individual courage or tactical brilliance. though those mattered. It was about production capacity, logistical systems, resource management, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was about sustainability over years of conflict. It was about depth of reserves and breadth of industrial base. America had all of these things. Germany didn't. The final numbers tell the story Hitler never wanted to hear. From 1941 to 1945, the United States produced roughly 300,000 aircraft, over 88,000 tanks, over 2 million trucks, and nearly 6,000 naval vessels. They supplied not just their own forces, but equipped Allied armies through Lease. They sent the Soviet Union over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, and 14,000 aircraft. They supplied Britain with everything from ammunition to food, and they did this while maintaining civilian production at levels that kept American citizens better fed and housed than any other warring nation. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 120,000 aircraft and 46,000 tanks across the entire war. The disparity wasn't close, it was overwhelming. Hitler spent his final days in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions on maps, insisting that wonder weapons would still turn the tide. He never publicly acknowledged the full scale of his miscalculation about America. To do so would have required admitting that his entire ideological framework was wrong, that democracy wasn't inherently weak, that racial diversity wasn't a fatal flaw, that industrial capitalism could outproduce his planned war economy. But in private moments, witnessed by those around him, the realization had clearly penetrated. Speer described Hitler in those final weeks as occasionally falling into long silences when American military operations were discussed, as if contemplating the magnitude of the miscalculation. One of Hitler's secretaries, Traudl Junge, later recalled him saying in late April, just days before his suicide, "The Americans have proven more formidable than we anticipated." It was a massive understatement, characteristic of Hitler's inability to fully acknowledge error. The Americans hadn't just proven more formidable. They had demonstrated a capacity for industrial warfare that exceeded even the most optimistic Allied predictions from 1941. They had built a military machine from almost nothing in less than 4 years, had projected power across 2 oceans simultaneously, had sustained years of intensive combat while improving their equipment and tactics continuously. They had done everything Hitler believed impossible. The tragedy, from a German perspective, was that this realization came far too late to matter. By the time Hitler understood what American entry into the war truly meant, Germany's fate was already sealed. The declarations of war in December 1941 had set in motion forces that no amount of German fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could overcome. Hitler had gambled that America was weak, decadent, incapable of military greatness. He had bet Germany's future on this assessment, and he had been catastrophically wrong. The final irony is that Hitler's own ideology prevented him from understanding his enemy until it was too late. His racial theories told him that a diverse democracy couldn't compete with a racially pure dictatorship. His contempt for capitalism blinded him to its productive efficiency. His belief in the superiority of German military tradition made him underestimate a nation that could learn, adapt, and improve with remarkable speed. America didn't win World War II alone. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of German military power. Britain stood alone for over a year and provided the staging ground for the liberation of Europe. Resistance movements across occupied Europe tied down German forces and provided crucial intelligence. But America's industrial might made Allied victory possible. It provided the tanks, planes, ships, and supplies that enabled offensive operations. It replaced losses faster than the Axis could inflict them. It sustained years of combat across multiple theaters simultaneously. And Hitler, for all his strategic acumen in the early war years, never truly understood this until Germany was already defeated. His realization, when it came, was too late, too incomplete, and ultimately too painful to fully acknowledge. In the end, Hitler had declared war on a nation whose true strength he didn't comprehend, fighting a type of war he didn't fully understand, against an enemy whose greatest weapon wasn't courage or tactics, but the unglamorous, relentless power of industrial production. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California and Virginia, the aircraft plants scattered across America, these were the real weapons that defeated the Third Reich. Hitler realized this eventually. But by then, American soldiers were already in Berlin, and the war he had started with such confidence in December 1941 was ending in the ruins of his capital. The Führer, who had mocked American weakness, spent his final days hiding underground from American bombs, defeated by the very nation he had dismissed as incapable of military greatness. He had asked whether America could fight forever. The answer, delivered in millions of tons of steel and explosives, was yes. America could fight as long as necessary. Their industrial capacity made them effectively inexhaustible. They could replace every loss, sustain every offensive, and continue fighting until total victory was achieved. Hitler realized this too late to save himself or his regime. But he realized it nonetheless, in those final weeks in the bunker, as the sound of American and Soviet artillery grew closer each day. The nation he had declared war on with such contempt had proven capable of something he never imagined, waging industrial warfare on a scale that made Germany's vaunted military machine look almost quaint by comparison. That was the final lesson of Hitler's war with America. Not that the Americans were better, soldiers though many were. Not that they had superior tactics, though they often did, but that they had built a system capable of producing war materials in quantities that made victory mathematically inevitable, no matter how long the war lasted. Hitler had asked the wrong question. It wasn't whether America could fight forever. It was whether Germany could survive long enough to make the question matter. The answer to that question was no.